these presenters and to the sponsor of the sessions 5 and 6, Tribal. Please make them welcome when you move into your next session. Thank you. I'll see you soon.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the afternoon session. Congratulations on hanging in there. It's been a long day for some who've been online for a while. So my name's Fiona Bygraves. I'm the chair of the Bass region for ATEM, and I'm delighted to be with you for this session. I'd like to thank our session sponsors, Tribal. And if you are posting on social media, I encourage you to use the hashtag TEMconference. If you've got any difficulties with this session, please click on the red handset on the bottom of your screen and move to the lobby to speak to a live tech support team if you need it. And if you've got any questions throughout the session today, please make sure you use the Q&A session on your screen, and we'll have a look at those questions at the end of our session today. And don't forget to use the discussion board. Any questions that remain unanswered, please check back later, as our presenters, if they run out of time, may have a chance to go back and answer those questions for you. So let me just hand over shortly to our two presenters, and I'll introduce them to you first. Ada Chung is the Manager Placemaking and Activation at UWA. She has over 15 years experience working in arts, events, media and placemaking. Alongside Ada today, we'll meet David Gulland. David is an architect and principal at Hassel. He is the principal in charge of the recently opened $80 million eZone UWA project for the University of Western Australia. So I'm going to hand over to them now to kick off today's presentation. Thanks, Ada and David.
Thank you very much. Okay, so today's session, we're here we go. Right, thank you for that. Off to a smooth start. So want to start off with an acknowledgement of country. We do note that the campus that we're sitting in at the moment, myself and Ada, is on Noongar land, and so we want to pay our respects to the Noongar people of the Whadjuk Nation and their elders, past, present and emerging, and also a big part of this project and its site as well. So what we thought we might do today is I would talk just for a few minutes about the design strategy behind the project, but the main focus of the talk is really about the students and how they've been interacting with what gets designed without them really being physically in the space, and how we got to where we were before Ada can then talk about the activation and what the students have been doing on the actual site itself. So maybe a little bit of context for those of you who don't know where the site is. Basically, the campus at University of Western Australia sits on the side of the Swan River. It is a very beautiful campus, and it has got pretty extraordinary grounds, which we know that people are very fond of that for the people on the campus itself. And what we do sort of note about when we're on that site itself is that there's an area to the northern end of the campus where there's some really beautiful buildings, and that's where everyone goes to get their wedding photos being taken and so on. But the site that we have, which is kind of where the cursor is around at the moment, is on the western flank, being a little less photogenic. And it was a bit of a problem for the university, not part of the brief for the project, but a problem in that there wasn't really a very clear entry point into the campus on that western flank. So we wanted to try and sort of recognise what the actual site was like before we started getting into the design of the buildings in any kind of a way. So the starting point for the brief itself, there was obviously quite a strong focus on the learning spaces and the accommodation schedule and what types of rooms. We have a series of laboratories, different schools of engineering are being accommodated, but it was a big focus in the brief about what the student experience was going to be like. And so when we talked about the briefing experience, some of these less tangible, less quantitative issues about how do we improve what the students themselves were going through was really quite a big and active part of the brief itself. On the grounds themselves, the landscaped grounds of the University of WA are really something that's quite special and quite unique, and is a real driver of the identity of the campus itself. So as much as we had a real focus on the rooms and the buildings and what was going to be happening inside those rooms, it was important for us to have a bit of a sense of what the identity of University of WA really felt like, which as much as anything else was a little bit like this experience of this guy sitting in a tree unplanned, just using his laptop. And so that was a big thing for us as well. And so we did want to try and have a bit of a sense of that connection in the final built outcome, which had that sense of the grounds coming into the building, and a building which felt quite permeable and also created that entry point into the campus from the western side. And that was quite a big part of the way in which we were thinking about the campus, even outside of the schedule of accommodation for the actual rooms that are going to be going into the building. So right back in, I think it was 2016, we had a series of sessions with user groups, reference groups, and we had representatives of the students themselves, academics, researchers, and a lot, not just the agenda of what rooms are going to be going into the building, but there was a lot of discussion around what did we think was going to be important for this building on its specific campus. And so the really three principles that we were starting to look at was, the first key one was about connection and exchange, and how do we make a deliberate effort to get people to actually bump into each other. There was a series of separate schools of engineering, all of whom tended to operate in their own little spaces, and we wanted to try and find ways you could get crossover between curriculum and different people in that area. The inside out and outside in approach was a way of trying to get those beautiful grounds of the building and trying to bring them from the outside into the building itself, so having literally planting right up inside the building itself. And the outside, we wanted to express to the outside, I guess, what was happening inside the building itself. So the laboratories and some of the really interesting activities that go there in the hydraulics lab and the structures lab, we put that on ground floor to try and express what was happening inside those spaces to people walking past. So all of these things really do come down to that connection between people as being a key driver. And we think that that was what's going to lead towards an inspired learning journey. So the site itself, there actually were two separate projects when the project first kicked off. There was one project which is a brand new building, and there was one refurbishment project of an existing building. And one of the first things that happened was we said this would be better if it was one combined project. And when we did make it one combined project, it gave us the opportunity to develop a space between the two buildings, which actually became almost the most important part of the project itself, even though that wasn't where the official learning studios and so on were. It did create this western gateway from Fairway into the heart of the site itself and its main James Oval there, which was another byproduct of the design which came out of our discussions with some of the UWA community. In that collaboration process, the whole series of different discussions and people that we're having to engage in. And again, a lot of these things not being very quantitatively based on how many square metres per person and so on, but were really influential in how the design progressed and how we thought the building would probably be used in the future. A lot of those coming down to what would be the informal breakout spaces, the role of landscape inside and outside of the building, and even some of those areas for having those unplanned interactions between people, those serendipitous conversations, which we thought would be an important part of how the facility should actually work in the future. And of course, in that process, there's a whole series of engagement with, I guess, our design team and how we're putting things together. And there's massing studies from the outside, but similar discussions on what's happening on the inside. And a lot of between spaces and how we actually connect people. So in terms of the, I guess, the transparency of the facility and having greater levels of flexibility, it was very important for us to try and use the spaces which are in between the main learning spaces that you'd expect to see as part of a schedule of accommodation, and try and use those spaces so they did more for us than just purely providing circulation and movement. So this diagram here starts giving you a bit of a sense of all the in-between joining circulation spaces, which we thought could be more heavily used than previously might have been thought about. And so each of these in-between spaces, which did include external spaces and courtyards as well, were designed as being learning spaces in their own right, informal breakout areas and ways in which students could start interacting with each other. So another view of that same sort of space in the circulation zone, and this is really showing that entry point from the western side of the campus, which takes you open 24/7 directly all the way into the heart of the campus, and things like an extra wide staircase, learning steps, and a whole series of other elements which we wanted to try and express and spread in and around and amongst the building. So part of it was to do with getting the greenery to step up through the building, up these learning steps, up to a planted garden area here for all the HDR type students, through to areas like a little meeting connection between the refurbished building you can see on your right-hand side and the new building on your left-hand side, and other spaces deliberately set aside where we're sitting at the moment, for example, as an industry incubator space, which gets used for project type work between students and the wider industry and researchers and academics as well. So another view of those spaces, and maybe the thing to emphasise here, is this designing what we think would be a usable space and a useful space for students. And we did have ideas about how we thought these spaces might get used, but they were very much our assumptions. So with the learning steps, for example, we had areas that we thought would be much more of a didactic mode sort of, and you know, none of these were program spaces, but we thought there'd be zones where people might actually stop together and look at something, or there might be more social spaces, which we have seen since the building has been opened is kind of where people tend to have, especially during study week, that's where all the pizzas get eaten. And then we have the individual spaces outside the learning studios themselves where people can break out of a room where they've had some formal learning or interaction and try and make sense of what they've just been dealing with. So that was very much our assumption about how things might work. But of course, we never really knew exactly how it might be used by the students themselves. And so this gives a little bit of a view, which is just outside where we're sitting right now, in fact, of what the overall environment and trying to get that sense of the greenery and the sunshine coming into the building. Very much I guess, the human attributes of a design, which we think is the kind of thing we thought would be attracting students to come in and stay on campus and not to sort of visit or be entirely remote or just go off somewhere else. And that's really the direction that we were heading in. Another view here of that same learning step zone and linking staircases. And within there, we had lots of little spots where you could have little viewing points. If someone's walking up from downstairs, someone from upstairs, you might bump into each other and have an impromptu conversation on the way down, or look at what's happening down at an event down in this space down here and so on. So this is obviously a very pristine or architectural photo. And it was taken during the unfortunate COVID era that we were dealing with at the time, which makes it great for taking a photo of a building, but it's all about the people and interactions with the spaces themselves. So this is really where ADA starts coming into play about what's going to happen when the students actually come in and occupy the space, as opposed to what our assumption is from a designer's point of view. And so really this starts coming into what the design reality is of the building and how the students start interacting with it in itself, which is probably quite a good point to start handing over to Ada to have a bit of a talk about what the reality has been for the students who've occupied the space.
Perfect.
We'll just manually move you across if that's okay, in our high-tech way.
Thank you, David, and thank you for designing such a beautiful building. We definitely want to touch on how this building connects the students to campus, and it's a case study of eZone and its impacts on campus activations. So I want to talk about the relevancy of the campus experience, because I imagine many of you at the moment are still in lockdown and trying to decipher, what the role of the campus is in terms of the student experience. Or what we do know from research is that students who spend more time on campus, they tend to study more generally. They experience higher levels of growth and satisfaction, and it's linked to a greater sense of belonging and mental health. And I'm sure there might be research coming out in later days, just kind of indicating what a flipped or online learning experience will do to student experience. But we were lucky enough in WA to have a taste of what a post-COVID era might look like. I know that we promised a presentation on activation, but placemaking is really the hero of the show here. So placemaking is a people-centered approach to planning, design, and the management of public spaces. To put simply, it involves looking at, listening to, and asking questions of the people who live, work, and play in a particular space, and this space being the eZone Student Hub, in order to discover needs and aspirations of the community there. This information is then used to create a common vision for that place, and it can evolve quite quickly into an implementation strategy, beginning with a small-scale, doable implementations and improvements that can immediately bring benefit to the community there. It is also pretty relevant and authentic to the audience. So basically, I use the analogy of trying to organize a party for a 20-year-old. If you organize it, some people might come, they might think it's not very cool at all. But if a 20-year-old organizes a party for a 20-year-old, you can be pretty certain that many people will come, and it'll be relevant and authentic experience for those attendees. Placemaking is also very affordable, and it can be vision driven in the way that you can set some certain strategic objectives, and you can achieve those objectives through placemaking. Some of the objectives that eZone set was to drive industry connections, student leadership, and promote wellbeing and socialization. So at a glance, what happened? Last year, we held 552 events in the space, and this year we've held 1,604 so far. We've spent under $20,000 on, and we've had over 90,000 people attend an event or activation in eZone. And what that equates to is really about less than $10 per event was spent, and less than 25 cents per attendee that's come into the space. And I guess this is really relevant because when you look at a post-COVID campus, our resources are tighter than ever. Our budgets on the extras and nice to haves is probably not as healthy as we would like them to be. And so to use placemaking as a sustainable approach to activation is actually quite clever in this type of climate. And it really illustrates the power of stepping aside and allowing the community to utilize the spaces on campus, the spaces that we already have, and maybe are a little bit underutilized or unloved. that happen, I'll give you a few practical steps on what we did over here at eZone. We started off with consultation and conversation. So to the left-hand side, it's pretty lo-fi, but we had a whiteboard and we continued a conversation about how eZone was doing with the students. Students could write anything that they wanted, any hurdles they were experiencing in utilizing the site, any improvements that they wanted to see made. You know, some of the things that we came up with were to do with infrastructure, so more water fountains, more security. We've got a comment there saying the doors are too squeaky or sensitive. And so we made that, we used that to make improvements and to have an ongoing conversation with students about the use of the building. To the right-hand side, it's a common master planning kind of tool, which is, you know, getting people to put different activity types and use a sticky note to place it on a map of the site. And that way you get to understand what uses people want for which spaces. And then you can also begin the conversation about, okay, so you want a jazz night. Do you want it bad enough to be able to actually commit to it and organize it yourself and incentivize that type of behavior? Framework and incentives. So you often hear that there's a lot of red tape with organizing events on campus, and sometimes the job of an activations person is to reduce that red tape. So you may do this by changing the security protocols so it's safer and more secure for students to hold these events. You might change your booking system. So here at UWA, we use Syllabus Plus, which I think a lot of people utilize. And connected to that is a system called Resource Booker. We recently went live with Resource Booker for students, so both students and staff have equal access to spaces around campus. We spoke to our public liability insurance provider, so our insurer saying that, you know, we predict that there'll be an increase in student activity. We predict that we'll have X, Y, and Z different types of activities on campus, and made sure we were covered from a liability perspective. And I think we also share, most universities around Australia share the same group of insurers, and they're actually very amenable to changes or ideas and different usages around campus. And we also created an event asset. We bought event assets so people could easily hire things that they would commonly need, like trestle tables, chairs, lecterns, speakers, and things like that. So that was to build up a framework to support activation. And then in terms of incentives, so we wanted to encourage activities that we wanted to see in the space. So we incentivized industry connection by offering catering vouchers. We incentivized wellbeing and socialization, and also upping students' marketing and branding capabilities. So what we did when encouraging activity types is, for the first 6 months, we ran eZone just to measure baseline data to see what events were occurring, how we could support them, and also which events were not occurring that we wanted to see in the space. And then we encouraged that type of behavior by creating some programming in the gaps that we saw. So this is an alpaca, which is one of my favorite animals. And the alpaca was here for Stress Lestival, which was a small festival that we curated during exam time to reduce the amount of stress and increase the amount of well-being that students were experiencing. We also had a desire to, from students that learn how to adult. The series was called How to Adult series. And so that tackled things like nutrition, you know, leasing a house for the first time or renting with friends, how to do your tax, how to start saving money, and those kind of street smarts that come with, growing into adulthood. And so we ran one with Brendan Pang, who was a master chef, on how to create a cheap and nutritious meal for under $5. And then we collaborated with different students and staff so they could, build on that activity. We wanted to use the outdoor space a little bit more, so we encouraged, we curated a street party with food trucks and music, and now there's much more use of that outdoor space since then. So sometimes you have to show people what's possible in that space. So let's see what the students achieved on their own. We got quite a lot of student-led industry collaborations. So we had, post-COVID industry analysis. We had mental health with BHP, men's mental health with BHP and our student clubs. We had with capital investors and bank managers. We had panels on women in computer science and programming, and this was all student-led activities. In terms of well-being and socialization, we got a whole gamut of activities. So from singing to create a little bit of self-love on Valentine's Day, create a bouquet for yourself. More music. This is a Filipino Appreciation Society doing karaoke night. During exam time, someone adopted that whole stress festival ethos and did canvas painting and bubble tea. Cultural dance, not so cultural dance, and some Japanese drumming. And in terms of student leadership, we had panels on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We had students brainstorming how to make the UWA campus more sustainable generally. We had teaching kids during school, different programs run by students for students. So what happened as a result? So over the past 2 years, we found that 72% of surveyed students said that they had spent more time on campus since eZone opened. 70% said they had spent more time studying in groups and socializing in eZone. The event numbers have tripled this year, and there's just been under 15,000 meeting room bookings. And that really shows that for us, after lockdown, students really together on campus, and students rated eZone an 8.8 out of 10, which is a really solid result. 91% of respondents said that eZone had made their time at UWA better this year, and it really speaks to the fantastic architecture of the site, but also the fact that they feel that they belong and play an active role in what happens on campus, and they're shaping their own campus experience. So placemaking in a few steps. 1, find an underutilized or unloved space with potential. Get agreement to trial the alternate uses of the space. 3, find some enthusiastic supporters that might help you cross the line in a couple of different areas. 4, have a small party at your space and consult the broader group about the types of activities that you might want to have there. 5, translate those ideas into action, or come up with an action plan and implement a series of short-term trials. They don't have to be, a proper program. Then invite students to utilize the space, incentivize if necessary, and ask for their feedback. And then you can develop a longer-term plan and design for the management of that space. And I urge you guys to give it a go. What could go wrong? This is the University Engineers Club having a dance party with a smoke machine 10 seconds before the fire brigade was called out, and the alarms in the building went off and the whole building was evacuated. That has been the worst thing that's happened so far in the space. But really, as a payoff, having all of those events and activities in the space has really benefited the student experience. So that's the end of our presentation there. Thank you very much for your time. And I'll flip over to Fiona.
Oh, well done, Ada and David. Perfect timing. We've got one question here from Joshua, and it's probably more of a question for David. How did you go about the consultation with staff and students and other key stakeholders in the design of the e-zone?
It's a good question. It was quite a long process. I think what really happened was it was a really strongly university-led group. It was led by John Dell at the time, who was in charge of the entire Faculty of Engineering, as it was at that point. And he brought together a series of leaders in the different disciplines of engineering who really were all committed to how do they build a better sense of collaboration amongst themselves. So the driver did really come from the university itself. And then they were just really open to us having discussions where it wasn't, okay, we've developed a schedule of accommodation and here it is, we're going to email it to you, now make the building as affordable as possible. It was very much a broad discussion which was led by the university, saying we need to make this place more attractive for students to come here and to stay on campus, and we need to find better ways in which all the different people working on campus would actually integrate themselves more clearly than they had been in the past.
Yeah, there were two key kind of consultations that really stood out for me in the development of e-zone. One was, it was very of the era, it was called the Game of E-Zones, where we invited a lot of students and staff to do that master planning process that I showed you with the sticky notes before. And then we also had furniture packages delivered to our key library over here, Reed Library. And so students could sit on it, they could touch and feel it, and they actually chose the furniture packages that we used for the building, and also the different colours that appear around the building. So there's mostly concrete, but with pops of colour, and they had a huge role in choosing those as well.
That's terrific. We've only got a couple of seconds left. Just very quickly, what staff roles did you have that support the activation and placemaking activities?
To be honest, there's just a lone soldier, so there's only just me on this very big campus. So yeah, it was definitely more of a consultation, planning, and role which needed influence.
Yeah, well done. Look, I'd just like to thank you both for your presentation today, and I'd like to thank our sponsor Tribal for the session. Next up, we have a networking function at Melbourne time, 3:25. So go back to your timeline and click on the Monday wrap-up socialise section and have a go. And don't forget to complete your survey when exiting this session. So thanks very much for your time, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your TEMC.
Great. Thank you, everyone.